About a year ago, I noticed a lot of glowing YouTube reviews of the book Against Our Better Judgment by Alison Weir of If Americans Knew fame. Presumably, the algo was pushing this because of the Israel-Palestine conflict post-October 7th and generally my interests in the JQ topic. I decided to pick it up, and while it wasn't my priority, I read through it. Quite a short book. And though I could do a review, so here we are. There are 16 chapters, each only like 5 pages long or so on average, so quite a short read. The preface explains how she set up her org after becoming interested in the conflict during the Second Intifada. Obviously, I'm quite biased, and while not everything she says is false, I will mostly be looking at errors or faulty reasoning in the book, or just sins of omissions/lacking overall context. Even in the preface, she stretches the truth a bit by saying at the beginning of the Second Intifada, 140 Palestinians had been killed before any Israelis in Israel. This isn't technically true, although more Palestinians definitely were killed during the first few days. Israelis also were killed, and where makes it seem like Israel just decided to kill some Palestinians for fun, with no real context or motivation to use violent force. Not going to dwell on the preface. Found this guy Jack Sigmund who critiques her a bit here on preface and early chapters, but it generally shows how the tenor of the book will be. That being said, let's get into it. Chapter 1. Just 2 pages long and basically just says the Israel lobby is more powerful than other lobbies. There's plenty of issues where the Israel lobby has lost to other interests. Google a whack Saudi Arabia deal, or look at my previous stuff on Saudi Arabia, or YT videos on Mearsheimer's Israel lobby book. I don't want to dwell on this too much as she's just making a generic claim and will focus on specifics later, but can also look at these articles for some good primers. Counterfire, Brookings, Washington Institute, Free Press. Also, I'll just add that basically every president has done things Israel didn't like, from Eisenhower forcing them to leave the Suzy in the 50s to Obama passing the JCPOA, but I'm taking too much time on this. Chapter 2 goes over the beginnings of Zionism a little with Herzl and in the U.S. in the late 1800s. Nothing too much of note, although one can quibble with things here and there, and I will include a review from a scholar on academia that has an incomplete review of her work. But for this chapter points out that while most of the land was owned by Muslims, it was primarily Ottoman-owned, not necessarily Arab, but not a huge deal, and technically in line with Weir's assertion of it being owned 99% by Christians and Muslims. Over time, Jews would buy more, and a lot of the land was public lands as well, so while owned by the Ottomans, later owned by the British, gets murky quite fast. Chapter 3. This chapter discusses Louis Brandeis and his involvement with the Parashim, a semi-secret fraternity of Zionists created by Horace Collin. Interestingly, a figure I have spoken about before in regards to Kevin MacDonald and Eric Kaufman, but over a different topic. Where makes it seem more sinister than it really was. But basically, it was just a small group of dedicated Zionists who wanted to coordinate with each other and push Zionism in more directed ways rather than just appeal to the masses. Collin even saw Zionism as a liberal project in the same way as America's idealism and a project for democracy and promotion of liberty. Can argue he was naive, but not the point. Point 1. It's true that Brandeis was a Zionist and played a role in U.S. politics, and even being part of this group does tell us how much he was involved. But the group itself did not get much done, and Sarah Schmidt, the author of an article on the group, more or less labeled the group a failure. Point 2. Chapter 4. This chapter goes over the idea that Zionists urged the U.S. to go into World War I on behalf of the British so that the Balfour Declaration would be issued. I will mainly cite the Ron Unz article on this subject and would urge people to read or listen to it themselves. Unz agrees that Jewish Zionists wanted to take credit for the U.S. to be involved in the war to bolster their clout. He mentions Weir and seems glowing of her regardless of this chapter, in which he ultimately disagrees with her conclusions. But both name-drop lots of figures involved and quotes of Zionists, essentially saying they were the reason the U.S. went to war. However, Unz points to other more elite, powerful Jews who were against going to war in the Declaration. People like Jacob Schiff, Adolph Oakes, Edwin Montague, etc. And how many WASPs, either due to ethnic ties or business ties to England, wanted to join the war against Germany, whilst many German Jews in the U.S. were against it, like the Warburgs. Many Jews also were against allying with Tsarist Russia at the time, which was pretty much the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. Even some WASPs viewed American Jews as leading opposition to joining the war. Essentially, Unz argues that most Jews were anti-Zionist or neutral and pro-German, so it doesn't make much sense, and most testimonies of Zionist sources like Landman arguing that the Zionists were the reason why the U.S. entered the war were just to bolster the supposed influence, or imaginary influence, of the Zionist lobby at the time. Unz ends his article by showing how real anti-Semites like Henry Ford opposed the war and obviously disliked Jews, but never brought up Weir's theory, nor did Hitler, and other anti-Semitic historians like Wilmot Robertson didn't buy it either. Lastly, Germany announced it would end its submarine neutrality weeks before negotiations over Balfour even started, not to mention the sinking of the Lusitania years prior and the Zimmermann telegram, all of which assured the U.S. would get involved without the need of some foreign or internal element to seduce them into it. Chapter 5. Weir discusses the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I and how Zionists seemed to dominate over those opposed and suppressed the King-Crane Commission, which shed doubt on building a Jewish state. Weir tends to simplify things and only focuses on specific events/people. She argues that the Zionist delegation suppressed the Crane Commission and makes it seem like Zionists were the only ones opposed to it. But even before the conference, Sykes-Picot was a factor in leading the British and French to not just want to give Arab independence. The Crane Commission was a survey of all former Ottoman territories, not just Palestine. The State Department itself, who were lauded throughout the book as being pro-Arab, was said to have suppressed the publication for not being compatible with the public interest. According to a letter from Henry Fletcher to Secretary of State Leland Harrison. Point 3, from what I can gather, this essentially meant a desire to not upset British/French imperial claims and to not want the U.S. to be embroiled more in the Middle East. The commission called for U.S. troops rather than British/French ones to oversee the former Ottoman territories. Weir does mention U.S. Christians at the peace conference advocating for Arabs, but doesn't mention that Emir Faisal also was present at the conference on behalf of Arab independence as well. At the end of the day, the main winners of the war were going to decide what to do, not the Zionists or Arabs, and it was not mainly about Palestine. That was more a footnote to the conference. Chapter 6. This chapter goes over a couple parts. First, it discusses Hugh Gibson, an American diplomat who investigated supposed anti-Semitic incidents in Poland and concluded they were exaggerated. This earned him ire from some American Zionists, and Weir claims that Felix Frankfurter would block Gibson's confirmation by the Senate due to his report. There is no source in her book for this, and nothing happened to Gibson to affect him politically, and remained a diplomat. I will add that another report by Henry Morgenthau, an anti-Zionist Jew, did go back to Poland and found a bit more evidence of anti-Jewish attacks in the country than Gibson let on, but still did not describe them as pogroms and was somewhat cautious in his reasonings for why they occurred. Weir then goes on to mention the Havara Agreement to taint Zionists as Nazi sympathizers. This is not only ironic because of the famous Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin Husseini, who literally met with Hitler and promoted the Nazi cause on radio, but also the contemporary pro-Palestine scene that is filled with neo-Nazis and pro-Hitlerite propaganda. Even Weir's own work is connected to the Holocaust-denying Institute for Historical Research, not to mention the various pro-Nazi movements amongst Arabs in and out of Palestine, albeit for anti-British reasons as well. I don't care about accusations of Nazism, just be consistent with it. She also claims that Zionists were the main reason why Jewish refugees weren't allowed into places like the US and UK during the rise of the Nazis. This has far more to do with immigration policy like the Johnson-Reed Act, and when the actual war was underway, concerns for the war effort overrode any humanitarian concerns. With this being said, the idea that Zionists just wanted Jews to die if they didn't end up in Palestine is not accurate. Zionist organizations were among the most vocal in the refugee resettlement cause for, and author David Wyman states in his book Abandonment of the Jews that he has seen no evidence to support the charge that Zionists intentionally avoided rescue efforts or that they failed to support immigration to other countries besides Palestine. Point 5. Lastly, she brings up false flag bombings that took place in Iraqi synagogues done by Zionists to spur immigration of Iraqi Jews to Israel. This is something claimed by people like Naim Jaladi. There is controversy over his claims, can just wiki him. But regardless, plenty of Jews had already left / had been persecuted in Iraq before these bombings in the early 1950s. The Farhud being a big example, also pro-Nazi sentiments in Iraqi politics, etc. and in general mass Jewish exodus from the MENA was always spurned in part by violence, usually just from the local populace. Chapter 7. This chapter describes the push of the Zionist lobby in the 30s to put pressure on politicians and to influence Christian support for Zionism. She describes people like Emanuel Seller, she can't seem to have a consistent spelling of his name, and Jacob Jervitz aggressively pushing Truman to be more accommodating to the creation of a Jewish state. I don't have too much of an issue with this, I can believe it. Even Truman says as much in his memoirs. But her labeling of Christian support for Zionism as manufactured or astroturfed by Zionist orgs like AZC is not super convincing. People have agency and aren't just dupes for some Zio cabal, and the roots of Christian Zionism go pretty far back in American history before the 20th century. Walter Russell Mead in his book The Ark of a Covenant shows that various Christians from John Cotton to J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller were supportive of the idea of a Jewish homeland. Also, one of Herzl's early supporters was Reverend William Heckler. 6 Puritans like Increase Mather, Henry Finch, and John Edwards, etc. all had eschatological views involving Jewish return to the land. 7 statesmen and religious leaders even teamed up for the Blackstone Memorial to petition President Harrison in 1891 to pressure the Ottomans to give the land over to the Jews, something American Jews were perplexed with and opposed to at the time. 8 I could go on. A distant cousin of George Bush was also an early proponent of Zionism. But suffice to say, it did not take Jewish subversion to promote Zionism to Christians, and most Jews were ambivalent to Zionism until World War II was well underway. 9 Chapter 8. Where starts off referencing the Dalit Plan or transfer policy to uproot Palestinians as a matter of pre-planned broad-based policy. I don't want to get into the weeds on this too much, as arguments between Benny Morris and Pap types get really niche and hyper-specific and not that interesting. Obviously, a lot of Palestinians left at the breakout of war, but some stayed and eventually became citizens. Not that complicated. She goes into Saida Munikim Begin interview where he seems to delight in terrorism. I think the interview is tongue-in-cheek, but feel free to look for yourself. The rest of the chapter discusses State Department officials like Acheson, Grady, and Henderson critical of U.S. support for the creation of a Jewish state. It's interesting to look at snapshots like this, and I don't doubt State Department Arabists didn't think it was a good idea, but many of their concerns didn't come to fruition. Even after threatening to cut off oil, countries like Saudi Arabia, who lobbied against Israel recognition, didn't do so, basically too weak and reliant on the U.S. 10. Not to mention U.S. polling tended to favor partition, and some presidential advisors like Clark Clifford did think supporting Israel would be beneficial to the U.S. in the long run. 11 Chapter 9. This chapter covers Truman's acquiescence to the Israel lobby over State Department fears by supporting Israel's creation. She mentions a report by George Kennan that outlined what could go wrong if a Jewish state was created and the U.S. backed it. Many of these concerns turned out to be incorrect according to Mitchell Bard, see previous citations. Not to mention Truman initiated an arms embargo in the area right at the time the first Arab-Israeli war was getting started, which was seen by many as an almost de facto pro-Arab move. 12. She ends the chapter discussing people like Eddie Jacobson and Abe Feinberg, 2 Jewish Zionist advisors/donors to Truman. Undeniably, Truman was influenced by these figures and concerned over the Jewish vote. But actually, at the time, the left wing of the Democratic Party, Eleanor Roosevelt being a famous bulwark of that wing, were also quite sympathetic at least to the plight of European Jewry and to the liberal national order, which at the time meant the UN, which approved a mandate for Palestine that the Jews accepted and Arabs rejected. Regardless of what the U.S. were to do, the Jewish state would have declared independence as the British were leaving, and the Soviets, at the time also favoring Jewish statehood for their own reasons, could have labeled Truman's as backtracking or going against something that the post-World War II International Order, Resolution 181 from the UN, had proclaimed. Chapter 10. Very short chapter on Zionist pressure on countries to vote for UN partition. This definitely did occur, but Arab countries also successfully pressured countries like Greece and Chile. Not that surprising that 2 groups in a conflict would try and influence others to side with them. 13. She also mentions the assassination on Count Foch Bernadette, who was killed by Jewish terrorists, which leads into the next chapter. Chapter 11. Briefly goes over some messages such as Deir Yassin and the King David Hotel bombing. I'm not going to defend Jewish actions here, but again were acts like only Jews committed violence. Obviously, before the partition plan/Declaration of Independence, there was violence from both sides. In 1929 Hebron, there was mass violence against Jews, killing dozens. Previous riots as well against Jews, but not as targeted. Weir makes the comment that half of the massacres of Palestinians by Jews were before a single Arab army joined the conflict. Looking at her own endnote for this talking point, it's evident she's wrong. Only a couple are pre-May 14th independence, and the day after numerous Arab countries declared war on the Jewish state. Not to mention violence and a smaller civil war were occurring after the UN vote in 47. Riots occurred in and out of Palestine incidentally, so in other Arab countries against Jews. And technically the first shots starting the post-UN declaration conflict were fired by Arabs attacking buses of Jewish passengers. One can argue these attacks were not just in retaliation to the UN declaration, but to prior Jewish violence. And even though the tit-for-tat game is a kind of boring game, we should at least acknowledge there is a game being played. Chapter 12. In this chapter, Weir goes over 3 groups who aided Zionists in Israel with arms and military assistance. Technically doing so did infringe on the U.S. arms embargo and the actions of Brookkorf, who apparently wanted to drop leaflets on London and also bombs from a plane to try and make some point to the English government at the same time, didn't succeed. I don't have much to say about these groups using Jewish money to go to a Jewish cause necessarily, but breaking the law in any fashion isn't great. She also inserts some unflattering quotes about Gentiles from the perspective of Kabbalah and Rabbi Kook, relying mostly on Israel Shahak's book, Jewish Fundamentalism. There have been anti-Gentile statements made in various Jewish religious texts or from religious figures. But there are clearly ideas of righteous Gentiles throughout Jewish though, and reducing it all to a couple quotes is inaccurate. I will post some responses to Shahak here as well as some sites that go over some controversial Talmud quotes here and here. Although some believe he had valid criticisms of Judaism, even from a Jewish perspective. I also don't think Muslims are inherently bad or hate non-Muslims, just because the Quran say non-Muslims are the worst of creatures. Quran 98:6. Chapter 13 covers a little bit about how some Zionist groups in the Jewish Brigade convinced, in a heavy-handed manner, some DPs, displaced persons, or basically refugees in camps post-World War II, to go to Palestine. Weir paints this as a super terrible thing, and I'm sure some DPs in Europe would have preferred to go to New York or something. Although there is evidence that a lot wanted to go to Palestine, look here and here, but as already alluded to, the gates of immigration were more or less shut, and there were DPs living in camps well after the war was over with nowhere to go or return to. She also mentions how Jews were then conscripted into the burgeoning Israeli military. This reminds me of people complaining about Ukraine having to conscript people forcefully into its army. That's just what happens when your country is under attack. I don't understand the complaint here really. Chapter 14. Just a couple pages on Palestinian refugees. I've already gone over people like Benny Morris' views on the Dalit Plan and Palestinian refugee issue. No doubt many people had to flee at the end of the day. I just personally don't think it's a huge deal in context of global history. World War II had just happened, millions of people died, and had to permanently relocate as well, not to mention the partition of Indian territory into modern-day Pakistan and India, which was a much greater population transfer causing more deaths. Nobody seems to call Pakistan into question, even though created around the same time as Israel, and other examples like the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Plenty of Jews in response to Israel/Zionism were essentially kicked out of most Muslim countries, reducing the nearly 1 million Jews in the broader MENA to less than 50,000 today. Chapter 15. Weir goes full Kanye and says the media is Jewish and is biased for Israel. I think this could have been true in the past, although books like The Media's War Against Israel, edited by Peter E. Goldman and Stephen Koretsky, paint a different story, but certainly not true in the modern day. Most European news outlets are fairly pro-Palestine. Obviously Al Jazeera in the Arab world. The Jewish-owned New York Times has no problem publishing op-eds about Israeli use of dog rape, and even Israeli papers like Haaretz are fine with the genocide label. Chapter 16. The last chapter just kinda randomly ends with Dorothy Thompson, a reporter from the US who was critical of Zionism. I'm not totally sure why Weir chose this as her last chapter, but I don't have much to say on it. She's not really a pivotal figure. Either way, there has always been people critical of the state, and those who support it. Overall, I'm pretty late to the game on this book review. I read it a couple years back, so just going off old notes. Mostly she commits sins of omission and doesn't really put things into their full context. It's just not a very well-structured book, throwing in tidbits here and there without really a continuous through line. There are plenty of better books out there like Rashid Khalid's. Yes, I know there are criticisms of that as well, but at least it's readable compared to this. Or America and the Founding of Israel by John W. Mulhall, which covers a lot of the same ground as Weir. Also, in the days of AI, one can just fact-check or search for more context. Basically, everything Weir said, one could probably just find a PDF of this book and run it through ChatGPT and maybe do a better, more critical review than I did here. Slop book calls for slop methods. I don't recommend the book, but it also only takes like 2 hours to read, so at the very least it isn't a huge waste of time, only a little waste of time.